Jamey, welcome to Let's Talk Quality. How you doing?
Hi, Hamish. Happy to be here.
Good. Glad to have you on, Jamey. Well, look, I'll give the listeners a very quick overview of who you are right now, what you're doing, and then we'll
Yeah,
work backwards from there.
sounds good. Okay, so I've spent almost my entire career in quality, but most recently I just joined R1 Therapeutics, actually June 1st, so just over a month ago, as the head of quality, where I have the privilege of building a quality function from the ground up. It's a really important time for the company, and I'm most excited about the opportunity to build a phase-appropriate quality system to scale responsibly, to support a very innovative company working to deliver meaningful change for underserved patients, which is deeply personal to me, as we'll get into, and doing it with the right people, culture, systems, decision-making discipline in place early.
Brilliant. Well, lots and lots to talk about. Let's go right back to the start of your career. How did you get into science?
Yeah, so when I went to college, I was originally thinking about med school. When I look back, I didn't have a real connection to that other than I just didn't know a lot about other science careers out there. And so I knew I liked science. I was very interested in STEM. I was good at it. I enjoyed it. I loved the labs. So in my college experiences, I was just very drawn to the science, worked through some work study programs in some labs at NC State and made some connections there through some researchers. And so I had some exposure, and I knew I enjoyed working in the lab. And as I was, about to graduate, I knew I didn't want to go to med school, but I didn't really know what careers were out there. So I just started looking at the job boards and meeting with advisors and people in my network. And I think at that time it was like monster.com. And so you type in the keywords and lab, there were a lot of QC jobs that popped up, which I didn't really know a lot about the industry. But I joined a small company, a startup called Apex Biosciences was my first job out of university. And I worked there for about a year where I probably learned the foundational elements of GXP. It was mostly GMP. I worked in the QC chemistry lab, but we actually had internal manufacturing. It was a very small company, phase 1 program. And, like a lot of startups, probably about a year in, we ran out of funding and we all got laid off. And it was at that time devastating. It was like a work family. And as often happens, I think sometimes those things that seem to be devastating and career blows at the time end up being the best thing that ever happened. And that's what happened for me. I had the opportunity to join Biogen, which was local to me in North Carolina, had recently built a drug substance facility and was scaling up and preparing for commercial Avonex and some of the other early Biogen products. And I would say that's really where my foundation began. And I was at Biogen for over 20 years. And that's really where I learned what good looks like from some of the best leaders and colleagues that I've had the opportunity to work with in the industry. We had strong quality systems, very disciplined execution, operational excellence, cross-functional partnerships at scale. And so that gave me, I would say, my deep appreciation for how quality can enable innovation when it's embedded early and thoughtfully. And I really enjoyed working at Biogen. I had a lot of exposure, even though it was heavily a quality operations role. There were some opportunities to work with. Biogen has some strategic partnerships with other companies. We also did some CDMO work there, sitting on asset teams, and just some, exposure. I knew that there was a lot more to the industry than quality operations. And so I kind of got interested and was at a bit of a crossroads of, I had been at Biogen 20 years. Biogen was so good to me. I learned so much, but I knew there was a lot more out there. And so from Biogen, I moved into probably smaller, but more complex environments where the role of quality became even more visible and more strategic. My next role right after Biogen was Seres Therapeutics, where we worked on the very first microbiome oral therapy, no established playbook.
Yeah.
We, new modality, had to navigate preparation for FDA inspections,
Yeah.
review
Completely
cycles. It
different.
was very
Different world.
different, very
Yeah.
different. And I learned much more about the business and the end, just the things outside of just quality and compliance. It was a huge, I ended up having responsibility for end-to-end quality at Seres. So GXP, GCP, GMP, working with supply chain, CDMOs. And Seres was quite complex because while we did have some CDMOs that we worked with, we also had a lot of internal operations. And I think some of that strategy was just because of the complexity of the product. It was human derived, probably a lot of CDMOs wouldn't have wanted to touch this product. It was derived from human stool, and there were many, many different steps for purification and ultimately filling into an oral therapy. But that was it was really complex. There were international and domestic inspections that we were preparing for. And quite frankly, this was new to the FDA as well. So we were having to, write the playbook for how a drug like this should be developed and approved. And we did receive FDA approval, which I'm sure we'll get into, but was probably one of the, just crowning moments of my career. It was, very rewarding, and it was a great opportunity.
So let's just go back then. I want to talk about, I suppose, going back to. So you spent 20 years in Biogen, right? Before going in. I know you worked in the year or so in the startup, but 20 years in Big Pharma. I speak to a lot of people who have gone from Big Pharma for a long time into startup world, and they struggle.
It is, yeah.
With the lack of systems and processes, and like you say, your role goes beyond quality then when you go into the startup world. So
absolutely.
What do you think it was that you obviously succeeded in your role when you went from Biogen into Seres, and you've gone into another startup now? But a lot of people do struggle.
Yeah.
What do you think are the key things that allowed you to have success?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something that I think about a lot, especially as I talk with other leaders and try to help them navigate career changes and, finding like what's a good spot for you and what resonates. And for me, transitioning from Biogen to Seres was quite humbling. It was, I went from a company where we had whole entire functions that you could go to with a simple question to there might even be one or two people in the company that has a similar experience. It's very different, but the skills and the learnings and all of the, everything translates. Like everything that I learned, both technically, foundationally, from a compliance perspective about the regulations, all of that translates. What's different at a startup, I would say, is that it's not at Big Pharma or even mid pharma. You have processes and systems in place already that you're navigating. At a startup, oftentimes you don't. You're creating the infrastructure, you're navigating this complexity, and things don't necessarily apply perfectly because nobody's walked this road before. And so I think staying curious, admitting that you don't know or you haven't had that experience before. But also at a startup, what I think is really helpful and actually has made me not just a better quality professional, but I would say a better business partner, is you have more view and understanding of other aspects of the business. Whereas at the bigger companies, it's not that you're siloed, but it's very different. You don't see end to end in the same way. And so I think having that view and sitting on leadership teams where there's functions that I didn't interact with in previous roles really gave me some of that nuanced perspective that really helped me make better decisions and be able to give input into strategic decisions for the company. And I think too, quality, we get a lot of, and I hear this all the time from other quality leaders, at some companies, quality is really viewed as a compliance function or a cost center. But what really resonates with other business leaders outside of quality is when you understand business and you can put quality concerns in a framework of risk, regulatory complexity, inspection risk, consequences of, CDMO readiness or lack of readiness. That resonates, just kind of black and white, compliance, yes, no, I haven't seen that before, or navigating this doesn't resonate with leaders that aren't working in a quality space as frequently.
How do you learn that? The ability to talk in sort of revenue terms and talk the language of,
Yeah,
because
good
you
question.
probably weren't in your role at Biogen. You probably weren't
It was very different. It was very
exposed to that,
different. Yeah.
those conversations.
I think I learned that relatively quickly by being thrown in, into the fire, into the deep end, and sitting with something that I would have never had the opportunity to do at a bigger company, but having to sit in a board meeting and escalate, inspection risk or give examples of concerns I had from a quality perspective. You really learn you're going to have, they say you have 5 to 10 minutes for this presentation. By the time you get in, you're going to be running behind. And so you're probably going to have 1 to 2 minutes. And so really trying to distill the message in a way that's credible, but resonates, and why it matters to the company bottom line. And also having solutions, bringing solutions, or what are we doing about it, and clear asks. I think that was something that I maybe learned the hard way through a couple of awkward early meetings, but I had some early successes by just being as transparent as possible, and trying to, again, translate not just quality as the voice of no, or why it's going to be hard, but more of as the voice of how can we be successful, what do we need, what should you be worried about, and what are we worried about, so that you don't have to be. And being able to have those conversations, whether it's with the executive team, at times the board team. But yeah, I think, that's something that if you don't have a good view or understanding foundationally of the business, you don't see those connections. You don't understand how things that are happening in the plant may translate into regulatory risk or inspection risk.
Well, I see it all the time, obviously, in my role, but you probably are aware, if you're building your team in a startup, you're probably going to favor people, you may or may not, but you might favor people that have maybe learned their trade in Big Pharma, but had maybe 2 or 3 startup roles and done it
Yeah.
before, and have been exposed to it, and kind of, learned from the scars, got the scars, and learned from it, rather than somebody who's just spent Big Pharma, 15, 20
Yeah.
years in Big Pharma, and then you're then placing a bet on whether this person's worked out. Because I see a lot of people they can't thrive in that startup
Yeah.
environment when you go from a long career in Big Pharma. So it's probably, I mean, what would you be looking for in those individuals when you
It's a
are?
great question. It's something actually that's really top of mind for me right now, as, this is a startup. I mean, I was the number one quality hire. We don't have a team yet. And so I've been thinking a lot about what will make a good quality team, and what are those skills and experiences that are important. And you touched on it. One of the things that I think does not translate well, and I learned this recently at Springworks, which we can talk about, was acquired by a huge pharma, Merck KGaA, the German Merck. There was some really great things about the acquisition for the therapies, of course, but it was a really hard transition for the people, because we were in a very entrepreneurial, autonomous environment where we had to build the plane while it was flying. We were navigating multiple approvals in 2 different markets. We were navigating due diligence. You had a lot of autonomy to make decisions. And when we got purchased or acquired, and we were trying to navigate how are we going to work together and try to maintain some of the agility and flexibility, but also work in the bigger, more robust and mature systems. How is that going to work? And I've been thinking a lot about that too at R1 as we're hiring and starting to build. Is I think about that first person that took a chance on me at Seres. And I remember when I left Biogen, one of the reasons that I left Biogen was because a mentor actually told me, you're coming up on 20 years. It's going to be really hard to leave and get somebody to think that you can work in a system that's not Biogen. It kind of was not offensive, but I thought, really? But it's
Yeah.
true. It's, So I think it does take a special person, and it is very unique. I have found that most people are either really, really good at navigating in the smaller startups, the biotechs, like that's just their world. They like being able to make decisions and try new things and have a really good sense of risk-based decisions and what needs to be done now versus, okay, this is going to be important, but we don't need to spend a lot of time on this now, versus in the bigger companies with the infrastructure, you're just kind of, I don't want to say enforcing, but working within the systems and processes that you already have. And so trying to find out, on one hand, how do you get startup experience if nobody, gives you startup experience? But on the other hand, like, how can you ask those questions or get people to be thinking about, like, is this something that I can navigate? And I think that's hard for quality. A lot of quality professionals, even those that have a lot of experience, are still somewhat rigid and require frameworks and SOPs and processes. And I think for me, and something that I've found that's really important in from a cultural perspective in building at a startup is that quality culture isn't built through SOPs. Of course, framework and infrastructure and SOPs and processes are going to be important, but it's really those small moments, and there's many of them, where leaders either reinforce the right behaviors or let the wrong ones slide. And I think that's what is, really creating that quality culture much more than the documents and processes and procedures that you're putting in place.
Yeah. And so would you hire somebody with, who's just come out of 20 years of Big Pharma and, into a director level role and no startup experience now? I know it's a tough question to answer when you don't know the individual.
It's a tough question because I definitely wouldn't say no. Like I hire for, skills, curiosity, and I think, skills that translate, and somebody that is motivated and invested and willing to learn. I would say yes, but I would also ask some tough questions about their 20 years in the big pharma and what was satisfying about that, what wasn't satisfying about that, what was, something that they wish they could have done different, or what learnings do they think were valuable, and what would they be willing to leave at the larger company.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose a lot of these traits are built in your early, your school years, your upbringing, your environment when you are young, and obviously your early career. I mean, we've spoken about it before, is that the entry route into quality isn't very,
Yeah,
very clear for most people.
quality.
Most people, if not 100% of people, don't choose a career when they're at school to go into quality. They're
Never.
not sitting
Yeah.
at school and thinking, I want to be a head of quality, because there's no awareness of what that is.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a problem for the industry?
I do. That's something that I've put a lot of thought into recently and really resonates with me. And you're right. As you talk to the young ones, quality is never presented as an obvious career choice. I mean, I think STEM kids hear about becoming engineers, doctors, even research scientists. And I think even in some recent collaborations with industry, there's even some good opportunities to learn about manufacturing and some of those careers. But quality is invisible, I think, until you're actually inside industry and you find your way in through another pathway, whether that's the lab or manufacturing or many other pathways. It's certainly not part of the standard STEM curricula or narrative. I think schools emphasize discovery science, maybe over product life cycle, compliance. And quite frankly, I think quality, if you're not in it and haven't worked closely with it, and even some people that I've met that have worked closely with quality for many years still view quality as somewhat administrative if you don't understand the responsibility behind it. But STEM students, a lot of those traits and characteristics that make good engineers or make good research scientists, make good quality professionals. They're trained to ask why, they're interpreting data, they're understanding systems, they learn to follow the evidence, they think critically. These habits and skills translate directly into lots of things in quality, like deviation management, root cause analysis, risk assessment, inspection readiness, quality systems thinking. And I think quality can be a powerful early career pathway. And we talked a little bit about the benefits of getting that whole company view earlier. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of technical roles, you dive deep, but you don't dive broad. Whereas in quality, you see everything in one function, regulatory expectations, clinical, commercial, vendors, dealing with vendors, documentation, patient risk. It all sits within in quality. And I think it's, really a place where science, ethics, operations, and patient safety meet. And that's not something that when you have those early conversations with students or even interns or people that are interested in industry but don't know about all of the different pathways they could take, it's just not visible to them.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. Do you think are there any solutions other than enforcing the government enforcing a curriculum
Yeah,
quality? Are there other solutions of I suppose initiatives and things that quality professionals, quality leaders can do
I
now?
think so. I think industry and maybe even us as, advanced quality professionals have a little bit of an obligation to demystify quality, invite students in earlier, whether that's through, formally through internships and things like that, or going to career fairs or participating in science days, even in early, young students with that are interested in science and doing lab things. Some bigger companies, like I know at Biogen, they had a community lab. And that was a way for students to get excited about science. But even talking to young females, young males that know they like science about quality, I just think it's something that if we could give real exposure to quality as a meaningful career path and help them understand it other than a documentation role, people that are, again, detail oriented, curious, motivated by direct patient impact, it may be one of the best places for people to build a career. And oftentimes, people that start out in quality end up being better professionals in other areas of the business and vice versa. So I think I do think it's something that we should be thinking more intentionally about
Mm,
as an industry and inviting students in earlier.
yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think I think there's a lot that the industry, the quality professionals, quality leaders can do more of, and that's the whole point of, I suppose, one of the points of this podcast is to shine a light on quality and
Yeah, and I
inspire more
appreciate
people
that.
into the industry. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's obviously some incredible achievements that you obtain along the way. You mentioned there the FDA approval.
Yeah.
I suppose talk to us a bit about that. How did it feel when it eventually came over the line, and where were you? What was the drug? What was the company? Just paint a picture for that.
Yeah. It was, again, it was it was deeply meaningful. I remember the day we got the approval. Many of us were sitting in a boardroom in Cambridge in our
And this was
Sydney
at
Street location. This was at
Series.
Series.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had been a part of product approvals at Biogen, of course, but in a very different role. I didn't feel like I had personally impacted or influenced in the same way that we had the opportunity to do so at Series. At Series, we hosted some complex, very successful inspections, but very complex where we had to remember that we're the experts on the drug. And so, we had to navigate a lot of complexity, not just in the inspections. And again, because of the way the company was set up, where we had a lot of internal operations, donor facilities, we also had external operations. Our drug product was manufactured in Portugal. We were working with a company. This was also going to be their very first FDA approval, so an international inspection. It was a lot of questions, of course, both CMC and development questions coming in real time. And with a small team, many of the same people are supporting everything. And so it just felt very, very personal. This drug, patients, the drug was Vowst. And without getting too much into detail, the indication was C. difficile, which is a terrible, terrible gut issue, horrible side effects. It's very difficult, not just for the patient, but their families. They often have a lot of mental health implications of not being able to leave their home. And so they just didn't have good options. And this is a one-time therapy. It's taken orally. It's quite safe. There was, a lot of, it's just again, an oral therapy, and it's not something that you have to maintain, which is such a gift, I think, for the patients. But a little bit of a challenge from a business perspective is that, hopefully the patients take one course of VOWST and then are cured. Whereas, it's not like a monoclonal antibody or something where you're taking monthly infusions. This is, so it was really unique, innovative. I still remember sitting there in that room, and when we got the notice that it had been approved, I thought about every single person that worked on the drug throughout the course of it, wherever they were sitting, whether it was Portugal, California, where we were sitting in Cambridge, every single patient that had been waiting for it. And it just felt so personal and meaningful that we did it. And I knew, what went into it, what it took. I've maybe blocked out some of the challenging logistics of that day and what we had to go into from a launch readiness perspective. But I'll never forget those emotions of, it was just out of body. And it had such a fundamental impact on me and how I want to lead, and, what types of programs and companies I want to work at where, patient focus is first, and working on something that just didn't exist before was deeply meaningful, and something that I still think about often and carry with me.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make about being involved with a lot of product approvals at Biogen, but not necessarily having the same feeling of pride, I guess.
Yeah.
Because you're such you're one person in such a large organization, whereas you go into a small organization and you're playing so many roles. It's a smaller team, and it probably feels a bit like you're up against the world in that whole entire process. So, incredible achievement. So you spent 2.5 years at Seres, and then you went to Springworks, a couple of years at Springworks, and then there was the acquisition from Merck.
Yes.
And then you've gone into a real, again, proper startup environment. I suppose I'm always interested in the reasons why companies bring in a permanent quality head when they do bring
when they do.
person, when they bring them in. Because a lot of companies might be at phase 2, even phase 3, and might have, a couple of consultants, 2 or 3 consultants, and doing bits and bobs of, might have a fractional head of quality. You might have a GCP person, a GMP person, a QMS person. But they might not see the need to bring in a full-time head of quality for whatever reason. Maybe it's the cost of bringing in a permanent head count. Maybe it's other factors. But what are the, I suppose, reasons why a company will bring in a permanent head of quality at that preclinical or phase 1 stage, when a lot of companies might drift to phase 2, phase 3, and then think, right, then now we need to bring in.
I think there's no right answer for any single company. Like you said, there's a lot of factors and reasons why or why not a company, and maybe it's, related to the asset, maybe it's related to the experiences of the other leaders. There could be any number of reasons, but for me, and as I was thinking about what was next, and where I wanted to be, I think quality needs to be embedded one way or another in how the leadership team thinks from the very beginning. It's very difficult to retrofit quality culture than to build it in. And so I think even having, a quality leader that is able to sit on the leadership team as you're thinking about those things, like, what are the important values here? How do we want to work? What's important? What do we need to focus on? The quality person, can participate in those discussions in a way, again, that just thinks about building things in and enables faster, maybe, stronger infrastructure or decisions that are not going to have to be re-decided later. I think, for me, that's what's really important, and a company or a team that I want to be a part of that realizes that. And I think, depending on the phase and scale and the number of assets and the number of people in the team, and is it outsourced, is it internal? There's so many factors like we talked about, and all of those deserve different levels of QMS or fit for purpose quality systems. And so, like I said before, I don't think It's about, knowing when's the right time for SOPs. And of course, there is a right time for SOPs, and you're going to be challenged by the regulators eventually. And so you're going to want to be able to show kind of that thinking and how you were process driven and how that led to SOPs and all of that. But for me, I think it's really just about how the leadership team works and thinks, escalates risks appropriately, thinks about, because in a small company, a startup company, we talk about this all the time. Quality risks are business risks. If there's something that happens and, we think there's going to be an inspection failure, you see it a lot. Like that could become a deal breaker. And at a small company, much different than a large pharma, you don't have lots of shots on goal. Sometimes you have one or two lead assets, and it's so important. And so I think it's foundationally so important to build that culture in. Quality culture, from my perspective, isn't owned by and just directed by quality. Good quality culture is owned by everybody. But again, setting things up the right way and with that in mind from the beginning leads to much better outcomes than trying to remediate or retrofit quality in later. I'd be curious to hear your take on that too, whether it's now or just in subsequent conversations, because I think you probably get asked that question a lot, like what is the right time to bring quality in as a function, not just as people working on systems and processes. But yeah, I think it is different, but regardless of what the right answer is for each company, I don't think you can err on the side of bringing quality in too early. You can certainly, go too late,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
never too early to bring quality in.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't have the national data in front of me around companies that are successful in bringing products to market and at what stage they brought quality leaders in. But, speaking from experience and speaking from the clients and customers that I work with, now I'm placing heads of quality, VP, VP level, SVP level, from a range of different organizations, a range of different phases of development, but a lot in phase 1 and 2.
Yeah,
And in phase 1, those quality leaders will then start building their team out, getting their GMP
that's right.
person in place, the GCP person, the QMS person in place. And I think from what I see about the companies that I've placed with that have brought in heads of quality in early, there's a good culture in those organizations. The leadership team, the CEO, the founder, whoever it may be, they have a real understanding of the importance of a good quality head, not just from a compliance standpoint, but from a
Yeah,
strategic standpoint, in terms of
yeah,
where the company is going, what's the long-term vision of that company, what
absolutely.
do investors want to see. And I think it always is, it's a positive, it's a green flag for an organization, the fact that a
Yeah,
CEO understands the importance of bringing in a senior quality head at the earliest point.
absolutely.
That is practical. So
Yeah,
um, you know, you've come in at an early stage, and hopefully you're now building. You got the opportunity to build your team as you sort of move through clinical development,
yeah,
which is great. So, sort of capping off, and towards the end of the discussion, which has been great. But what are you this year ahead of you, next 12 months? I'm assuming it's going to be sort of building your team, getting the foundations in place. What are the priorities? What's most important to you in terms of getting this right from a cultural point of
yeah.
perspective, people's perspective, everything?
Yeah, I mean, it's, beyond just the obvious, which is, establishing the QMS, getting the right people. It's really influencing at the leadership level, creating a quality culture and reinforcing that culture through everyday leadership choices. Like, you touched on who you hire, what you reward, what risks are escalated, how do leaders respond to bad news, whether quality is embedded before decisions are made. And so I'm thinking a lot about that and how that can be reflected in not just, company values, but QMS, infrastructure, quality escalations, what do the leaders need to know? And so it's a lot of the foundational elements of early biotech where, a lot of our work is outsourced, obviously. So infrastructure of, vendor oversight will be important. Getting some QMS fundamentals in place will be important. But for me, it's more about just the opportunity to be a strategic partner and enabler to the business and build trust, for me. And we've touched on this a little bit, like quality leaders really earn trust when they can translate compliance into risk, regulatory consequence, business decision making. And so I really want to be a good partner to my colleagues in the business and help set things up so that we can be more successful as we navigate, advancing in the company.
Nice. Couple of quick fire questions just to finish things off, Jamie, before we end. If you were to go back to the start of your career and you had to give your younger self, some advice about your career, what would you say to yourself 25 years ago?
Yeah. I think get uncomfortable early. It's very easy to stay, especially in a larger company. You kind of get, I don't want to say pigeonholed, but you find out who's good at what and you kind of get stuck doing that because you're good at it. But, you don't learn as much just doing the things that you're good at. Step out of your comfort zone, learn some things that maybe you're not so good at or are not so obvious to you. As I mentioned before, also learn other areas of the business. It's so important. It will make you better at your job to know the challenges of the teams that you're supporting and what's important to them. I would have earlier seeked sponsors, not just mentors, but people that will speak about you in rooms that you're not in and know about opportunities that aren't visible to you. I was probably never a good self-advocate. And that's something that I would encourage young ones to do. And I think learning the business will help your sponsor better advocate for you because you'll have, a bigger toolkit or more skills that can contribute in other ways. And most importantly, I think I would tell my younger self and any young quality professional, keep the patient visible in every decision, in everything that you do. It really gives not just meaning, but will help you, literally, if you can think like if you're sitting with a really hard decision or a complex challenge. Imagine sitting over coffee with a patient that's going to be taking that drug or a family member. And if that impacts or influences your decision, maybe your decision isn't so hard. It may not be popular, but sit with the patient, keep that top of mind of everything that you're doing, understand as much as you can about the indication of the therapies that you're working on, and it really will make a difference.
Final question, if just going back to our point around STEM students and
Yeah.
lack of visibility of a career in quality, if you had 20 seconds, 30 seconds with a load of STEM students making their way at the early part of their career, and you had to make a case for a career in quality, how would you go about it? If you had 30 seconds to make that case,
Okay.
what would you say?
Yeah, I would say, if you're curious, if you're science based, you follow the evidence, follow the science. Quality could be an opportunity to get a bigger view, a bigger company view, business view, perspective on more, not just functions or departments, but opportunities to impact the company. And so it's a great way to learn broad and deep and not just deep technical. I mean, the technical skills will be invaluable. It's not an either or. I think it's a yes and. And so I think it's really important to think about that and understand what quality professionals do beyond the administrative documentation aspects, but really understanding risk, helping kind of maybe be the conscience of the company at times and protecting patients, protecting the company, protecting ourselves. So think about it. And I would be happy to talk with students. And I'm definitely looking for ways to give back. And so, as I said, I think our industry has a bit of an obligation to help foster the next generation of quality professionals. So, Hemish, I appreciate what you're doing. This is great. And thanks for the opportunity.
Well said. No, my pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show, Jamie, and sharing your journey.
Yeah,
It's been great listening to it, and best of luck with everything for this year.
I
With
appreciate
R1,
it.
exciting times ahead. We'll have to have you back on the show in a year or so and see how it's all going.
I would love
But I
that.
appreciate your time.
Of course.
Have a good one. Speak
You
soon. Thanks,
too.
Jamie.
Bye bye.